The factor theory. Introduction. So far, we have established the fact that differences in productivity and specificity are the basis for trade. Ricardian trade theory tells us that trade will occur if there are differences in labor productivity. This model therefore assumes that countries have the same factor endowment. However, in real life, countries differ in their resource endowment. The factor proportion or extra-hauling framework considers the role of factor endowment in trade. We will therefore now explore how endowment differential leads to trade. We will also examine the gainers and losers from trade. Learning outcomes. When you have studied this session, you should be able to 1. Apply the HO models to international trade. 2. Discuss the effects of HO model on income distribution. Factor proportion model of trade. The factor proportion theory was developed by two Swedish economists, Eli Excha and Bertoli Holin. The theory is usually referred to as Exchester-Holin or simply HO framework. The factor proportion theory shows the interplay between how different factors of production are available in different countries and the proportion in which they are used in producing different goods. Like in the factor-specific model, this model assumes two factors, two countries, and two goods. Also, the production of each good will require the use of two factors. Unlike the specific factor model, no factor is specific to any sector. For simplicity, let us assume the production of two goods, computers and textile. Further assuming that we have two factors of production, labor and capital. Let capital be measured per unit, while labor is measured per hour. We also assume that there is no market imperfection. That is, the market is perfectly competitive, implying that there is no wage distortion or price distortion. In particular, it is the forces of demand and supply that determines the wage rate, rental rate, and goods prices. Finally, it is assumed that there is always full employment of factors of production. Unlike the Ricardian model, there are no rooms for choice in the use of inputs. For example, producers of textile products in Nigeria may increase textile output by recruiting more workers, in which case textile is labor intensive. It may also be the case that producers may hire more capital in its production process so that the good is capital intensive. If more labor is used, then less capital must be used, and vice versa. In this case, there is a trade-off between the uses of factors. The question that comes to mind is, what will motivate the choice of input? That is, what will cause a firm to use more of one factor and less of the other? The relative cost of labor and capital, of course. If cost of capital is very high relative to cost of labor, a profit-maximizing firm will tend to use more labor and less capital. Conversely, if cost of capital is relatively less than cost of labor, a profit-maximizing firm will hire more capital and less labor. Thus, the choice of input rests importantly on the factor of price ratio. Now let us assume that the factor proportion in Nigeria is depicted as shown in table 3.1 below. That is, Nigeria will use 2 labors and 10 capital to produce 1 unit of computer, while it will use 20 labor and 5 capital to produce 1 yard of textile. Thus, the capital labor ratio in computer and textile will be 10/2, that is 5, and 5/20, which is 0.25, respectively. What this implies is that K/L for computer is greater than K/L for textile, where C and T are computer and textile respectively. Now let W represent wage, while R represent the cost of capital, so that the factor price ratio will be given by W divided by R. What equation 4.1 says is that at any W by R, production of textile will always use higher ratio of labor to capital than production of computer. In this case, the textile is labor intensive. It is easy to show the relationship of factor price ratio and capital labor ratio for each product. This is shown in figure 4.1 below, as can be verified from the graph. At W by R, that's one, which equals the quantity of capital required in textile industry, is QT, which is less than capital required in computer industry, QC, where W divided by R move to W over R for capital intensive is at E, while in computer it is E prime. Note that factor intensity demonstrated in this graph implies the proportion of factor used in output, not the proportion of factor used to output. Thus, a good cannot be both land and labor intensive. Concept of HO framework. Factor price equalization. Factor price equalization is a theorem, and it states that under identical constant return to scale, free trade will equalize relative price through the equalization relative product price as long as both countries produce both products. Under HO model, there is perfect mobility of labor within each country. Hence, countries will continue to trade until the relative prices converge. Given the fact that it is a relative international price that determines the value of marginal productivity, factor of production will earn the same reward everywhere in both countries. Stoper-Samuelson theorem. It states that if there are constant return to scale and if both goods are produced, a rise in the relative price of a product will raise the real return of the factor used intensively in the production of that good and reduce the real return of the other factor. Rybinski theorem. This theorem states that if relative product prices remain the same and if both goods are produced, a rise in the supply of a factor will lead to an increase in the output of a product using that factor intensively and a fall in the output of the other product, making it less attractive to producers. The relative reward of capital is high, making capital to move to the production of goods whose reward is high. The output of other sector would therefore crash. Factor prices and good prices. With the assumption of perfectly competitive market, if the economy produces the two goods, forces of demand and supply of goods will determine unit price of each good, and this will be equal to unit cost of each factor input. That is, if for instance the cost of producing computer is high, we expect the price of computer to rise. That is, cost of production depends on its price. But what accounts for a high or a low cost of production? If a sector, say computer, uses more capital, if the price of hiring a unit of capital rises, there is a tendency for total cost of producing computers to rise. Whereas if the price of labor rises, total cost may not rise, since labor are needed in small quantity in computer sector. Therefore, a rise in relative factor price will lead to a corresponding rise in output price ratio. That is, there is a positive relationship between factor price and output price. This is illustrated in the graph below. We can use figures 4.1 and 4.2 to show the relationship between goods prices and factor prices. To do this, place figure 4.2 beside 4.1 and let it face the left side as shown in figure 4.3 below. Assuming the relative price of computer PC over PR, then factor price ratio will be W over R. And at this factor price ratio, the ratio of capital to labor used in the production of computer and textile are K over L and K over L for computers and textile respectively. If the relative price rises to PC over PR2, then factor price ratio will increase to W over R2. At W over R2, it appears the price of capital appears to be relatively cheaper, and because computer uses more capital in production, the ratio of capital to labor employed in computer and textile also rise to K over L for computer and K over L for textile respectively. The graph therefore tells us that owners of capital will have a higher income relative to owners of labor. That is, capital owners will be better off relative to owners of labor. Relationship between goods prices, factor supplies, and capital labor ratio. For a particular output price ratio, factor price and capital labor ratio are known automatically. Because of the assumption of full employment and that full employment determines output level, it is important between good prices and factor prices and output levels. To paint the picture nicely, we shall use graphical exposition. Consider figure 4.4. The width defines the economy's total labor, while the length defines the total capital. Point V in the box gives the allocation of factors among the two industries, with textile having higher labor than computer, while computer has higher capital than textile. The line OC is the capital labor ratio in computer industry, while line OT gives the capital labor ratio in textile industry. Line OC is flatter than line OC to indicate that for any capital labor ratio, textile industry uses more labor than capital, while the converse is the case in computer industry. Given the prices of computer and textile and the supplies of labor and capital, it is possible to determine how much of each resource the economy devotes to the production of each good, and thus the determination of the economy's output of each good. The issue that remains unclear is how output will change if the economy's resources changes. To deal with this, Let us use figure 4.4 as our guide. Consider an increase in labor while capital and good prices are held constant. With this increase, the box in figure 4.4 becomes wider as shown in figure 4.5. This means that labor input will be measured from OT2 rather than OT1. Thus, resource allocation will move to V square to V to power 1. At V to power 1, a close inspection reveals the fact that labor used in computer has fallen, while labor used in textile has risen from LT1 to LT2. What this means is that if relative price does not change, an increase in labor supply will reduce the production of computer in the economy, and the capital and labor not used in the computer sector will be used up in textile sector, and as a result, the output of textile industry will rise disproportionately. How do we know this? Let us use the economy's production possibility frontier to explain this. Figure 4.6 shows that initially output of textile and computer was at point labeled 1. The slope of PPF is the relative price by P minus PC over FT, and the economy's output of each good were QT1 and QC1. After the increase in labor, P1 is the new PPF with the price ratio tangential to the PPF at PC over PT. At this point, the economy could produce more of both goods, but the PPF2 is larger in the direction of textile than computer, indicating that production possibility is biased towards textile production. The biasedness is so strong that with a fixed relative price, output of computer actually fell, and this is compensated for with a large increase in the output of textile. We have now discovered an important key in the possibility of international trade. That is, the effects of increase in resources endowment tend to bias output towards the sector that uses the resource intensely relative to others. This implies that an economy with a high ratio of labor to capital will relatively be better at producing textile, which is labor intensive, than an economy with low capital labor ratio. Conversely, a country with a high ratio of capital to labor will be relatively better at producing computer, that is capital intensive, than an economy with a low ratio. In a nutshell, it is advisable for a country to produce a good for which it is intensive in the relative abundant factor. Applying the model to international trade. Now consider Nigeria trading with the US, assuming that they have similar taste. Also assume that they have similar relative demand for computer and textile when faced with the same relative price. Further, we shall assume that the two countries have the same production technology. The only difference between Nigeria and the US is that Nigeria is assumed to have more labor than US. Conversely, the US has more capital than Nigeria. Specifically, Nigeria is labor abundant and capital scarce, while US is capital abundant and labor scarce. You should note that factor abundance in this case is defined in relative rather than absolute term. To get this clearly, let the total labor and capital be 100 million of labor and 500 million of capital respectively, while Nigeria's labor is 50 million and its capital is 10 million. Nigeria is considered to be labor abundant because its capital labor ratio is less than US, since 0 to 5, that is 0.2, is less than 500 to 100, which is 5. Meanwhile, in absolute terms, US is both labor and capital abundant. Thus, it should be noted that the resource abundance is strictly defined in relative terms. Recall that textile is labor intensive while computer is capital intensive. Hence, Nigeria's production possibility frontier will shift out more in the direction of textile than in the direction of computer. Since countries differ in their factor endowment, for any given ratio of the price of textile to that of computer, Nigeria will produce a higher ratio of textile to computer, while US will produce a higher ratio of computer to textile. This implies that for any relative price, the supply curve of relative output produced in Nigeria will lie below the supply of relative output of the US, as shown in figure 4.7 below. The RD line is the relative demand curve, and it is downward sloping. The RD is the same for both Nigeria and US due to our earlier assumption. The graph reveals an important outcome. If Nigeria and US did not trade, the relative price of computer will be higher in Nigeria, while it will be lower in the US. Conversely, the relative price of textile will be higher in the US but lower in Nigeria. Note that when trade occurs, relative price converges. Thus, when Nigeria and the US open up to trade, the relative price of textile will rise in Nigeria, while the relative price of computer will rise in the US. In the process, relative prices converge to a particular point, such as PW in the graph. In Nigeria, the rise in textile prices relative to computer will lead to more production of textile, and this will lead to labor moving from computer industry to textile industry, so that the output of computer will fall. Hence, Nigeria becomes an exporter of textile products. In the US, the price of computer will rise due to trade, and this will raise the production of computer so that US becomes exporter of computer. The analysis implies that when countries differ in their factor endowment and in their capital labor ratio, countries should export goods whose production is intensive in factors with which they are abundantly endowed. Income distribution effect of trade in HO framework. Trade leads to relative price convergence, and these have strong implications for labor and capital. For example, after trade, price of textile will rise in Nigeria and hence wages. This will lead to increase in the purchasing power of workers in terms of both goods. Conversely, trade will cause the price of computers to fall in Nigeria and hence worsen the purchasing power of capital owners. In the US, the opposite will be the case. That is, the purchasing power of US capital owners will rise in terms of both goods, while it worsens the purchasing power of labor. Thus, if the basis for trade is factor endowment differential, then owners of labor will gain in labor abundant economy, while owners of capital will lose. Simply put, in a HO world of trade, owners of abundant factors gain, but owners of scarce factors lose. Summary: In this study session, you were exposed to a model of two goods, two factors, two countries, with one of the goods having intensive use of one of the resources. Also, at a given wage rental ratio, production of one of the goods will be higher capital to labor than production of others. An increase in the supply of one factor expands production possibilities in a strongly biased way in favor of factor used intensively. Thus, a country having abundant resource relative to others will produce and export a good for which that resource is intensive in production. During trade, relative price converges, and as a result, income of owners of abundant factors gain, while owners of scarce factor experience low income. Overall, trade benefits both partners. This is the end of study session 4. Thanks for listening.